Today is October 8th, 2025. As I had warned before the 2024 US presidential election, regardless of who won the election, everything that was taking place under the Biden administration, which was just a continuation of what had been going on the previous Trump administration, which all was being built on top of, and a continuation of 8 years of Obama, and before that, 8 years of President George Bush Jr. Continuity of agenda had continued up until that point and would continue beyond that point. I warned people about this, and it was not a lucky guess. It was an examination of what both candidates were saying while they were campaigning, like carefully listening to them, not selectively listening to them, but also reading the policy papers from the corporate-funded think tanks that actually produce American foreign and domestic policy. People who got this all wrong, people who thought President Trump was actually going to end any war or transition the US in any sort of different direction than the direction it has been on since the end of the Cold War, the pursuit of a unipolar world order, of hegemony around the globe, a confrontation with Russia, China, Iran, and everyone in between. People thought that he was going to do these things because they fundamentally misunderstood how power in the United States and in the Western world actually operates. It does not operate. It is not determined by who wins or loses elections. Elections, the electoral process in the collective West, is a system of perception management and control. It is not a process of policy making or implementing policy. Policy is created by multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that fund think tanks. The people who are the shareholders and board of directors of these corporations also sit on the boards of these think tanks. And what they do, because there are many people who run these corporations, they have these think tanks. They have a multitude of them, and many times they are funding all of them. There's, one corporation will fund a whole collection of these think tanks. They are arriving at a consensus. They are working in the collective best interests of all of these corporate financier interests. They create these policy papers. The policy papers are taken by teams of lawyers, transformed into bills, brought by teams of lobbyists to Washington simply to be signed off on. They're also brought to the corporate media, conservative and liberal, all part of the same system, the same continuity of agenda, and it is sold to different target audiences, just like different products are sold to different target markets in the consumer world. And that is how Western policy is determined. That is what is driving Western policy. And if you understand that, and you look at the policy papers produced by these think tanks, you will have seen very clearly what direction the US was going in, regardless of who won the 2024 presidential election, regardless of who wins upcoming elections for Congress. It does not matter. These people are not there to change anything. They are there to sign off on it and also sell it to the public. That is their job. That is President Donald Trump's job. That was President Joe Biden's job. And they use left-right politics, conservative versus liberal, to create distractions, to distract people away from the source of the problem, dividing people against each other so they never unite against these corporate financier interests who are wringing them dry at home just through their monopolies over every means of life in the United States and across Europe, but also selling them these deadly, destructive policies of endless war overseas and the draining of resources at home for social programs, infrastructure, education, things ordinary people actually need back at home. So that is how it works. And if you understood that, you would have known exactly what was going on. But beyond that, again, if you listened carefully to the candidates, they also told you that nothing was going to change. And I'm going to prove it to you. First of all, I've told people many times, Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation, which is one of these corporate financier funded think tanks, published this all the way back in, you can see right here, 2023. This was published in 2023. And they laid out what was going to happen in 2025 after the presidential election. It really did not matter if it was a conservative or liberal candidate. This was always the agenda. And what was the agenda in terms of foreign policy and these ongoing wars? Division of labor, strategic sequencing, increase allied conventional defense burden sharing. Burden sharing is now referred to as, also referred to as division of labor. You will still hear it referred to as burden sharing. And they are talking about not only dealing with China, but also dealing with threats from Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These nations are not threats to the United States in terms of actual national security. They are only threats to the United States in the sense of impeding American hegemony abroad and obstructing American impunity as it operates on the global stage. And I've showed this article many times, and it's extremely important to understand this. This is all the way from 1992. This was at the end of the Cold War. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. It's often referred to as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. They even mention Paul D. Wolfowitz, the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy. And this was the concept that the world will be dominated by the U.S. and the U.S. will actively prevent any nation or group of nations from rising up and challenging American hegemony. It's not that they threaten the U.S. within America's own borders and in its region of the world. They threaten America's ability to act with impunity around the globe, to dominate the planet, to tell other people what to do in their country, on their side of the planet. And it says very clearly down here, rejecting collective approach. And they talk about collective internationalism. Back in 1992, they weren't using the term multipolarism. They were using the term collective internationalism. And the US completely opposed this. They wanted to be the sole decision maker of everything happening on Earth. And you could see this repeatedly stated, regardless of who was president, all throughout the 21st century, often referred to as American leadership. So that was back in 1992. The Project 2025, written in 2023, talks about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all of these nations that simply don't listen to the U.S. The U.S. dictates to them what to do within their borders and within their near abroad, and these nations say no. So this is an obstruction to American primacy, and so they are a threat, and they are to be dealt with. Before President Trump was even elected, before November 2024, there were articles like this. J.D. Vance, who's often referred to as the voice of reason, he is just another neocon, a warmongering neocon, tells Tim Dillon U.S. needs weapons to fight China, not Russia. Now, neither Russia nor China pose any sort of national security threat to the United States. They do not threaten the U.S. within its borders, except the manufactured, baseless threats the U.S. accuses these nations of, like Chinese special force operators sneaking over the border from Mexico into the U.S. by the hundreds or the thousands, as if you could overthrow a country like in the movie Red Dawn or something. These are ridiculous, absurd, manufactured, fabricated claims, just like WMDs in Iraq ahead of the 2003 invasion. Now, it says here, he's skeptical of military support for Ukraine. He said Taiwan's economy meant it was more important to American interests. And a lot of people mistakenly interpreted this as the U.S. wanting to get out of Ukraine. But J.D. Vance never said that. And as a matter of fact, down here, it said the Ohio senator has advocated a negotiated settlement in the Ukraine conflict, which, again, people misinterpreted as some sort of attempt to make peace. But if you actually click on that link and read the article, it's nothing of the sort. It says J.D. Vance floats Donald Trump deal to end war in Ukraine. But if you read the details of the deal, it is not ending the war at all. And it says, Vance said potential peace talks with Trump could involve a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone at the country's borders. That is not That is not peace. That is not ending the war. That is literally freezing the war. That is what the US did in Syria, and this is what they are trying to do in Ukraine. And then it elaborates a little bit further. I think what this looks like is Trump sits down, he says to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, you guys need to figure out what does a peaceful settlement look like, and what it probably looks like is the current line of demarcation between Russia and China. That becomes like a demilitarized zone, and that is essentially freezing the conflict. And it's frozen, not an attempt to then move toward peace. Just like in Syria, it is only meant to buy time to build both Ukraine and the rest of Europe's military capabilities back up. So when factors tilt back in America's favor, they could reignite the hostilities, just like they did after the Minsk agreements from 2014 onward. This is what they repeatedly did to Russia. They would pause the conflict in eastern Ukraine, rebuild Ukraine's armed forces, and then they reignited the hostilities again. And this is what precipitated the 2022 Russian special military operation in the first place. This US engineered overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, and then the deliberate military buildup in Ukraine, a NATO trained and armed military force aimed directly at Russia, right on Russia's borders. And for people who repeatedly accuse me of being anti-American, pro-Russian, just imagine if Russia overthrew the Canadian government and then began militarizing a puppet regime it installed into power with Russian weapons and missiles, long-range missiles pointed straight at the US. How long do you think the US would tolerate that? Do you think the US should tolerate that? And if the answer is no, then you've just answered your own question about whether what the US did in Ukraine was right or wrong. It works the same. And again, America, as a nominally Christian nation, do unto others as you want done to you. If you don't want others doing this to you, don't do it to them. If you do it to them, don't be surprised that they react in the exact same way you would react if someone did it to you. So that brings us up to before the election. So they were saying, we're not ending the war. We're going to freeze it. And we're going to dump it on Europe. We're not stopping it. We're not trying to achieve peace. The Trump administration itself has accused the Biden administration of starting the war. And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio even admitted it is a US proxy war being waged against Russia. So it is not up to Russia to end a war the Trump administration itself admits the US started and is waging against Russia as a proxy war. Again, if it was the other way around, how would the US react to it? And should the US just put its weapons down on its own borders with this threat pointed at it without resolving the source of this threat? Obviously, again, the answer is no. But then after the election, President Trump wins the election, and as early as February of this year, U.S. Secretary of Defense, before they changed it to the Department of War, Pete Hegseth, again, laid out a very clear strategy to possibly freeze the war, but definitely not end the war, at least not end it on anything that would be acceptable to Russia. They're admitting that they cannot return Ukraine back to its pre-2014 borders. That is unrealistic. They're claiming that there must be robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again, but they mean freezing it, not actually achieving any peace. And they're claiming that it must not be Minsk 3.0, but it literally, everything he is describing is Minsk 3.0. He even talks about, he's claiming end the conflict, but he means freezing the conflict. He's talking about deploying European, basically NATO troops to Ukraine to create a buffer zone so that Russia would hesitate to reignite hostilities once they realized that, no, the conflict isn't over. There is no peace. The US and Europe are just rebuilding Ukraine's army for another round of hostilities because it is actually Minsk 3.0. So he's talking about deploying essentially NATO troops to a non-NATO mission, not covered by Article 5, because what the US is doing is dumping the conflict on Europe, all of the responsibilities, all of the consequences on Europe while it pivots to China. He also talks about to enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. And then he's talking about American energy production. Lower energy prices coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions will help bring Russia to the table. And they mean subordinate Russia, get Russia to capitulate. And he's talking about that. And we can see how this objective of targeting Russian energy production has manifested itself in drone and missile strikes on Russian production, energy production deep within Russia. All of these drone and missile strikes, we know for a fact, are the product of US intelligence being shared with the Ukrainians. These are actually operations almost certainly being organized and overseen by the US generals in Germany, who are actually at the top of Ukraine's armed forces chain of command. Again, we know this because the Western media has even admitted this. The people involved in this have admitted that that is how it works, the New York Times. The secret history of the war in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. And there's another New York Times article about how the CIA has been in Ukraine since 2014, long before Russia began the 2022 special military operation. And they're talking about how American generals are essentially running the war. And that includes up to today. I don't remember hearing President Donald Trump or anyone in his administration saying, well, we brought those US generals home. They're no longer overseeing the operation. We have transferred everything back over to the Ukrainians. And I have not heard him talk about the CIA pulling out of Ukraine. The CIA is literally on the ground in Ukraine, running Ukraine's intelligence agencies, not Ukrainians, the CIA, the US Central Intelligence Agency. They also talk about the CIA and military working together, and that they also have offices in Germany side by side with the American command structure. Okay, so these strikes on Russian energy production are being carried out by US generals and US intelligence agencies through Ukraine. That is why US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it's a proxy war. It's literally a proxy war. The US is fighting Russia through Ukraine. So that was another thing Secretary Hegseth said. And he also talked about more ammunition, more equipment, ramping up military industrial production. All of this was covered in this February public statement by Secretary Hegseth. And since then, that is exactly what Europe has been doing. And there was this bizarre perception management taking place where President Trump and the United States pretended to be some sort of neutral mediator of this conflict they themselves started and continue to oversee, and this proxy war that the US still continues to wage against Russia. They were pretending to be some sort of neutral mediator and blaming Europe for undermining peace talks and attempts to arrive at some sort of peace deal, when in fact Europe was simply doing exactly what Secretary Hegseth told them to do all the way back in February. And had a lot of people were skeptical about the conclusions I drew about this statement. I mean, what is there to analyze? He openly said that we are going to dump this conflict on Europe and pivot to China. That is exactly what the United States is doing. I'll get into what the US is doing towards China in an upcoming article and video. But it is interconnected, and how this continues to play out with Russia will determine how the United States continues onward toward China. Now, here we go with the long-range missiles. Just like everything else, if you remember the HIMARS, the M777s, the tanks, everything, they would float the idea. They would talk about how great it would be, how it would turn the tide, how then they would say it's not happening, it's not practical, it won't happen, and then the next day these weapons would turn up in Ukraine and they would end up being used in this conflict. And now we're talking about long-range missiles. There's a variety of missiles that are being discussed, including Tomahawk cruise missiles. These would be, I assume, launched by ground-launched systems. There is the Typhoon system that's the U.S. already has deployed in the Philippines and is pointing at China at the moment. Germany is supposed to be getting Typhoon missile systems. They can launch the Tomahawk cruise missile as well as the SM-6 missile. And now we're starting to hear talk as if maybe the Tomahawk might be transferred over to Ukraine after all. So, you know, this is how I cannot recall a single weapon system that they talked about this much and then never ended up sending to Ukraine. If they end up not sending the Tomahawk, then that might be a first. The German Taurus air-launched cruise missile, that is another one that they have been talking about. They have not, to my knowledge, sent to Ukraine yet, but that is something that they have been talking about and probably preparing to do for quite some time. They're talking about other missiles. I did a whole video on the extended range attack munition. They're basically jet-powered glide bombs. And I talked about how the whole concept for these jet-powered glide bombs is an attempt to create a cheaper mass of ordnance. Because again, the US for decades now focus on small quantities of high-tech, high-precision weapons. During the Gulf War, fighting against Iraq in the 1990s, and then again in the early 2000s, countries simply had no equivalent, and they had no ability to defend themselves from US military power. I would say by 2006, when Israel invaded southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah was using modern anti-tank missiles and other weapon systems that they got from Iran, and that Iran probably in some way got from Russia. They used these weapons. They were highly effective, and they blunted this advantage that the US and Western militaries had for decades. And from that point onward, we watched the Russian military reforming itself, building itself back up, having huge amounts of weapons, conventional weapons, and then also working their way into highly precise weapons, but also huge numbers of highly precise weapons. And I've talked about how that's possible for Russia and also nations like China that have state-owned enterprises that are producing these to serve a purpose versus the West and its military-industrial base, which produces weapons to maximize profits. Russia is capable of doing this. The United States is incapable of doing this. And the answer the US comes up with is something like this jet-powered glide bomb. The problem with this is, yes, it's much cheaper than anything the US is producing now at the moment. It's much cheaper than a cruise missile, for example, or JSON, or any other equivalent that they have right now. It is obviously an improvement. It doesn't go quite as far. It doesn't have as big of a warhead, but it is much cheaper, and you would have many more of them over time as you begin to mass produce them. The problem is Russian actual cruise missiles are maybe a little bit more expensive, but if you do the analysis of the size of the warhead, the range that it travels, and the cost of making it, and the quantities that are made of these missiles, it still is by far outproducing and outperforming even these new, cheap, affordable mass weapons that the US is exploring the possibilities of. And there are companies like Anduril out there that are talking about, the US can never make as many warplanes or naval vessels as Russia or China, but we can make these drones, as if China couldn't, if they're making 200 times more naval vessels than you are, they probably can make 200 times more drones than you too. Whatever drone design you come up with, they will make it, they will make one better, and they will make many times more of these. As this is a problem the United States has that I don't really think is solvable. However, I would warn people against drawing the easy conclusion that, well, then Russia and China win because their military industrial base is vastly greater, and they will never lose a war of attrition against the United States. Here, the problem is the United States cannot produce enough weapons. The collective West cannot produce enough weapons for Ukraine to turn the tide in this conflict in Ukraine. The problem is they are making enough weapons and ammunition to drag this out for years and exact an extremely high cost from Russia. And even though the cost isn't as high as the collective West is saying in the media in terms of the loss of manpower and equipment that they claim Russia is suffering, it still is a high cost. It is not as if they can shrug off these losses. It is a huge commitment. They are significantly tied down to the point where it's coming at the expense of other geopolitical objectives Russia had. For example, protecting the government in Syria from US-backed regime change. Because they got tied up in the special military operation in Ukraine, they didn't have enough resources to spare. The US succeeded in toppling Syria. And this is what I'm warning people against. Yes, the United States does not have a military-industrial base to match Russia and China, but they have other advantages. Their alliance system, this vast network of politically captured nations the US oversees, they're able to move their military across all of these countries. They have their military stationed in these countries, and they have a logistical network and the sea and airlift capabilities to move their military around the globe in ways Russia and China cannot. And so they tie Russia up in Ukraine, and then they can move their military to other places where Russia and China cannot react and defend against. This also gets into what we've seen more and more talk about this right here. This is very concerning. Macron, Europeans will impede Russian shadow fleet vessels in their waters. And I assure you, this is just one of many incremental steps they are working on toward trying to implement some sort of blockade. And they're doing it incrementally to see what works and what doesn't, and not to get too far ahead of themselves in case there is something that Russia can do in retaliation. They're doing it in a very measured and incremental way. They're turning up the tension and the escalation very slowly, just like they have throughout the entire proxy war in Ukraine, to avoid out of control escalation. And they will see what is working and what isn't, and do the most that they can do to try to impose some sort of blockade on Russian energy. And this is a beta test for a similar blockade they have been planning against China for decades. And I have entire policy papers. And again, I'm going to get into this in future articles and videos. They are talking and have been talking for years about implementing what they call a distant blockade on China. They operate outside of the range of the vast majority of China's missiles and other defensive systems. And again, they're leveraging that ability to move around the world with their military to block China where China's military cannot reach. And so they're beta testing this with Russia, and then they will extend it to China. And they have to do all of this before Russia and China develop the capabilities to either circumvent these distant blockades or actually use their own military force to break these blockades. So we are in very, very dangerous times. I want to take a look at the live map. I usually do this at the beginning of the video, but let's just look at the live map. Actually, not that much has changed since the last time I did an update and showed the live map. This is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map, and it's basically a visual representation of the Ukrainian general staff. Their daily reports on what they claim is going on the battlefield, and it's always extremely conservative in their favor. If Russia is making progress, they'll delay reporting on it for days, weeks, sometimes even longer than that. They'll exaggerate Ukrainian claims. But the reason I show this is because as biased and lopsidedly favoring Ukraine as this is, it still paints an extremely bleak picture. And you can see, let's go to Pokrovsk. Russian forces are right here in the edge of the city. And of course, if you're looking at other maps, Russian forces are in the city. and they are encircling the city. They have it encircled on 3 sides, and they have physically cut all of these roads off, and their drone units are cutting off everything else. And it is an operational crisis. They're also working towards Konstantinovka. And this is right at the beginning of this string of built-up urban areas that includes Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. This is the ultimate destination of Russian forces in the Donbas region. Once they take all of this, that will essentially be the entire Donbas region under Russian control. Seversk. Let me show you Seversk. Russian forces, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map, they are right at the edge of Seversk now. And if you go to the timeline and you go to the beginning of September, you will see just how far away Russian forces started. So this is over the course of about 1 month. They have made it to the edge of Seversk. And Kupiansk, this is in the Kharkov region. Russian forces are still in Kupiansk, and you know, there are all these claims about, well, they're just there temporarily, they were just sabotage units. Well, now even the pro-Ukrainian map has shown Russian forces in the middle of Kupiansk for days, if not weeks now at this point. And every single day we are watching massive Russian missile and drone strikes across all of Ukraine. These are huge missile and drone strikes. Of course, the Russian glide bombs continue to be used, and the shorter range Russian drones are operating all along the line of contact. These longer range drones like the Garan 2, they are operating far behind enemy lines. And it brings me back to talk of these cheaper missiles that the United States is claiming they're going to develop and give to nations like Ukraine and the Chinese island province of Taiwan to go fight a similar war against the rest of China. These missiles, you know, they're fast because they are missiles. They're cheap. The warheads are very small, and their range is so-so. A Garan has a longer range, much larger warhead, and even though it's much slower, there are so many of them, it doesn't really matter, and Ukraine just physically does not have the ability to shoot them all down. And at this point, there are so many videos now of the Garan 2 drones finding and striking at their targets. So there is a general collapse of Ukrainian air defense. There was all of this talk about all of these sophisticated systems they've developed to shoot down the Garans, to conserve from using very scarce air defense missiles they have to use for the cruise and ballistic missiles Russia is launching in the dozens or scores per attack. They're out of everything, and this is the problem that Ukraine has always had, that the collective West has. In a conflict like this, in a war of attrition, Russia and China, they will ultimately win, which is why the US is using proxies instead of fighting with Russia and China directly. They will use all of these proxies, and despite the advantage that Russia has, it's still taking them a long time to move across the battlefield, to exhaust and break Ukrainian forces, collapse their lines, and take Ukraine, to eliminate Ukraine as a national security threat against Russia. So these are all things we have to keep in mind. And it's not just a US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. There is a global conflict taking place, and it's taking place across a spectrum of activities: financial and economic, direct military conflict, proxy war, and of course, political subversion and the political capture of nations through US National Endowment for Democracy funded political interference, which is taking place all over the world. People think that it was defunded and dismantled. It is not. This is their website. It is up right now. Where this is a picture from Thailand, actually, right there, where NED works. They work everywhere, every inhabited continent on planet Earth except for North America and Australia, because they're already completely politically captured by the special interest the NED represents. And so there is a global conflict taking place. We have to keep an eye on all of it. And this is just an update on what is going on in and around Ukraine. We have to keep an eye on the fighting on the ground and whether or not Ukrainian forces reach a breaking point and what happens after that. We have to keep an eye on this incremental buildup to what is essentially at least a desired blockade of Russian energy shipments. And then if that is successful, they will extend that to China. That is what they are working on. They are working on that right now. And they have been working on it for years, and it has transcended presidential administrations. It was something they were talking about all the way back in 2018, talking about the obstacles to achieving it, and then they took concrete steps to overcome those obstacles. And that took place under the first Trump administration. All throughout the Biden administration, the US Marine Corps was reconfigured to participate in what they call a distant blockade of China. And now we are setting the stage and preparing the ground to implement it under the second Trump administration. So we have to keep a close eye on all of this. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. All of my videos are posted there. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. So if ads pop up, feel free to skip them. In the video description below, if you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and through Patreon. Again, those links are in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare, there's no need to apologize. Simply help share the work with others, get the word out there. All of that helps make this work possible. I thank you sincerely, and as always, thank you for watching.